Hello and welcome to the Migraine Diaries, a week-by-week account of the making of my game Scotoma and my ongoing deterioration as a human being. This episode I'm going to discuss what it took to get to this point with the help of the excellent 8-Bit Ape. So let's just dive in, shall we? One thing I should mention is that I'm not saying this is the way things should be done. This is just the way I've done it. I'm figuring things out as development progresses, so if you know of a better way to do it, then more power to you. It's not an exact science. Also, this is more about how I've constructed it than why. So it probably goes without saying that control over the thematic direction and the narrative thread of the game was very important to me, as I didn't want to go straight into demoing and production without a solid idea of what the game both is and isn't. And for a long time I hadn't really been certain, and so piece by painful piece I'd narrowed it down through collecting images, playing other games, noting literally hundreds of ideas down, and then periodically going back over what I collected and just thinning it out to the best stuff. I even wrote a 36,000 word novella when trying to work out what the protagonist's motives were. It wasn't very good, but it was a useful exercise. So firstly, I had to settle on the scenario, and the location was pretty obvious to me, as I'd spent a number of years working as a pixel artist in a particular building. And during crunch times, when nearly everyone else had gone home, I used to explore the building during breaks I took away from my desk, and it was the creepiest fucking place at night, and exactly the type of office I described in earlier episodes. A sort of a prefab, cheaply assembled, quite low-grade building. And I can tell you that a dead silent, pitch black hallway does a right number on your imagination, and I knew that was exactly where I wanted the game to be set. So the first step was to map out a sort of a fictional version of the building, and I used sort of rudimentary voxel models just inside Unity for, ease of realizing this. So yeah, the story was a bit trickier. I'll talk about the actual plot points some other time, because I don't want to get too sort of Alien Covenant with it and just spoil everything before the game's even out. But working it out structurally is worth going into, though. I knew it would be home to a company, so I researched the sort of mundane, kind of dull organisation I had in mind, which in this case is an insurance adjuster. And also what sort of size it should be, the departments it would need to function, and the sort of hierarchy it would have, sort of all that sort of stuff. And from that point it became obvious what the principal theme should be about, which is power and the abuse of it, because to me there's no better example of society in a microcosm than the workplace. We all have to spend a huge proportion of time negotiating an uneasy and conditional set of alliances with people we might not necessarily even choose to be around. And I've encountered loads of fascinating situations in my office days. People are pretty bizarre. So essentially, in this case, the form dictated the narrative. The next thing was to populate every position in the office and kind of see who stood out. At this point, all I knew was what I wanted the main antagonist and protagonist to be, but pretty much nothing else. In my other sort of non-career as a songwriter, I sometimes like to come up with a bunch of song titles just off the top of my head and let that dictate the lyrics and the melody and the wider song. So I took a similar approach here, found a typical company structure, reeled off names for every single position, and those names basically told me who those people were. After that, I sketched out a number of different plot lines I wanted to see, and then used the hierarchy to work out who was involved in each one. And it was bloody useful to get a handle on what would prove to be quite a complex story. From that point, I realised I'd have to turn to my old nemesis, the spreadsheet. As the game begins after some sort of pretty cataclysmic events have already taken place, I'd have to plot everything up to that point. So I settled on a time period and kind of slowly filled in the details. And following that, when I came to design the progression of the story once the game actually starts, and how the mechanics will help you work your way through it, doing all of this pre-production work was incredibly useful, mainly for the sake of continuity and reference as development progresses. The whole thing has been kind of like just a giant jigsaw puzzle, and as I've worked on it, the sort of obvious sort of set piece event points have kind of made themselves obvious. And while I was working on the narrative, I was working equally hard on the actual sort of mechanics of the game. If I was going to have a story that was essentially rigid, which it is, I knew I'd have to do more to kind of justify that approach. And this is one of the reasons that right from the start, I wanted the meat of the puzzle solving to be based around what you know about the inhabitants of the building, because it makes the narrative much more key to the experience rather than something that can just be sidelined if you don't give a shit. But however, I knew that asking the player to piece together a complex story from scraps of information that are sort of revealed over the course of about 5 hours playtime without any help would be a pretty sort of tall order. So I came up with the idea of an inventory system that records details of literally everything the play sees and learns, you know, about floors, rooms, objects, people, events, and so on, and allows you to arrange them into sort of connected webs of information. This will help break down the narrative into sort of understandable vignettes, kind of in the manner detectives do. And once certain pieces of information are correctly linked, they yield event nodes, sort of key happenings in the game that help make sense of the wider picture, which can then be sort of linked, further linked to other information. And linking things correctly can also affect what happens in the world. So there's sort of plenty of scope for this particular mechanic. The second main mechanic is making use of the PCs that obviously fill the office, which in games is admittedly nothing new, but I do plan to go further than most. For example, you'll need to obtain admin privileges to get access to other computers, use shared servers, de-encrypt files, use the intranet, and so on. Plus, all PCs are fully searchable for all sorts of file types and also within documents. So if you're armed with the right information, you'll be able to get ahead. This aspect of it actually came before I was aware of Her Story, which is a great little game in its own right. But that to me proved that approach has some mileage in it. I also made a couple of small demos with Game Maker, which admittedly stalled both due to a lack of time and my impatience with coding. But the experiment was definitely worth the time spent. And all of this is to say that pre-planning before going into actual dev can be a great thing. That said, the trick is to kind of leave enough room for experimentation or for the realities of what you want to do to evolve as you go along. And that's not an easy balance, but games are such complex beasts. Some change from what you originally put down on paper is inevitable. In many ways, at least to me, game development is a kind of a programmer's playground. So as a non-coder, I'm kind of up against it in some ways, which makes the sort of proof of concept demo that I'm aiming for at the moment crucial. And that is where I am at the moment. So, join me for the next instalment about the alarmingly simple and quick process of making indie games, which will be, use it. Got the official Indie Game Maker handbook here. Let's see. The next thing will be influences. Cheers.